Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. So I'm really excited for this panel, which is going to explore the nexus between housing, transit, and climate change and meeting our climate change goals. So it's no secret that California has struggled to meet its housing needs over the past few decades, and the housing affordability crisis has really become a hot button issue over the last few years, the most recent Brown administration. Governor Newsom has now signaled a commitment to facing the crisis head on, and this year, again, we're seeing a huge wave of legislation that's designed to address the affordability crisis. And then at the same time, as we've heard today, California continues on its quest to meet its aggressive greenhouse gas reduction targets. Chair Nichols spoke this morning about the reality that those targets can't be met without meaningful changes in the transportation and housing sectors. And both transportation and housing infrastructure will play a key role in meeting those 2045 targets. But improving access to affordable, sustainable, equitable housing and transportation remains a significant challenge. So today we're really lucky to have with us three fabulous panelists to talk about the compatibility of the state's housing and climate change goals and some of the successes and challenges that we've had along the way. So here to my left, we have Jeannie Lee. She's Chief Counsel at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Prior to joining OPR, Jeannie was Deputy Attorney General in the Land Law Section of the California Attorney General's Office, and she also was an attorney before that at Remy Moose Manley in Sacramento, focused on CEQA litigation. Before joining the legal field, Jeannie was an environmental planner in Sacramento, so deep experience in these issues. And Louis, to Jeannie's left, is the Legislative Director of California YIMBY. So in that role, he helps coordinate policy development and legislative advocacy efforts for YIMBY legislative priorities, and he'll talk a little bit more about those today. As an analyst in the California Department of Finance, Louis worked to develop and pass Governor Brown's 2017 and 2018 budgets, which included work on legislation to improve the delivery of government services and quality of labor protections. Before that, Louis was an executive fellow with the California Air Resources Board in the Office of the Chair, and in 2016, Louis co-founded House Sacramento, which is a local YIMBY organization up in Sacramento. And we also have with us today Jennifer Ganata, who's a senior staff attorney at Communities for a Better Environment. Jennifer joined CBE in September 2018, but previously worked there from 2007 to 2012 as a youth organizer and a legal fellow. And she transitioned from doing environmental justice work to housing by starting her housing career at Eviction Defense Network. Before returning to CBE, Jennifer was a senior staff attorney at Inner City Law Center, where she did eviction defense and land use. Jennifer has a deep interest in connecting her passion for environmental justice and housing in order to defend frontline communities' right to housing in a better environment. So with that, I'm going to ask Jeannie to kick off our conversation by providing some historical context on the state's housing and transportation-related initiatives and the current landscape at the state level.
Thank you, Julia. Okay, can you all hear me? Yes. Good. Okay. No? Yes. Push more. Okay. I can also yell. Okay. Is that good? Okay. So I have a PowerPoint. It's mostly so that you're not just staring at me and you have some pretty pictures to look at. And also, we at the Office of Planning and Research really like to show photos of transit and housing. We get very excited about these things. So, oh wait. Oh no. Who did I do that?
No, I
Sean did it.
I was trying to get us to the.
It's just the next slide.
Yeah, I think we have the
Okay.
clicker.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yes. Life is good.
Okay. So if I turn behind me, it's just because I'm trying to figure out where we are on the slide deck here. So like Julia said, I am the Chief Counsel at the Office of Planning and Research. I was also there under Ken Alex and had the pleasure of working with him and the Brown administration. And when Ken said earlier I thought, well, I would love for him to keep abreast of what OPR is doing. So if he wants to call himself we, I'm perfectly fine with that. But we do have a new director. Her name is Kate Gordon, also wonderful, and I encourage you to just follow her along. She's been speaking across the state on various issues. So Julia mentioned that I was just going to get us to a common starting point and just talk about what has been done in the state as in terms of housing and transportation policy, and what we can possibly expect with this new administration. So I think the short answer to what we have done and what we can expect is basically a lot. It's been a lot of things, some of which I'll talk about today, but just because of time, we can't go through everything. But I did want to start back in time, the last 2 years of Governor Brown's administration. We saw 2 consecutive years of housing bills. In 2017, that was a package of 15 bills. You can see I just threw up just a few talking points up here on the basic points of that package. I'll highlight a few things. So there was definitely more funding for building, including affordable housing. One of the big things was Senate Bill 2, and so if you have been involved in any real estate transactions since 2018, you would have noticed that there was a $75 fee on your real estate transaction. So that money has been going to funding planning grants, as well as some of OPR's work and HCD's work, which I will talk about later, closer to the end of my presentation. Another important piece was Senate Bill SB 35, which was Scott Wiener's bill. That got a lot of attention. It helped reduce regulatory barriers at the local level. Some other important pieces, preserving low-income housing and also giving HCD some more authority to refer cases to the Attorney General's office. You may have heard about the Attorney General's lawsuit against Huntington Beach, and so that authority comes from AB 72 and their existing authority. So just for those who are not aware of the Huntington Beach case, the Attorney General's office recently sued them for not providing enough housing and complying with the regional housing goals. Okay, so moving on to 2018, there was also a package of bills. I'll just focus just on a few of these. There was a particular one that increased density. So this is, I guess I would call it it's commonly known as the BART bill. It's AB 2927, I believe. So BART is basically the Bay Area's subway system. BART has a lot of land around its subway stations, and it doesn't have, or previous to this law, it didn't have local land use authority over it. So this bill allows them to have that local land use authority. BART currently, or previous to this bill, it had transit-oriented development guidelines. And so as part of this bill, the bill said that local agencies had 2 years from the adoption of the bill in order to basically adopt BART's TOD guidelines, or just by operation of law, BART's TOD guidelines would just apply. Another kind of interesting thing that happened was that in planning and zoning law is in the government code, and so there was a loop that was basically closed. Charter cities did not have to comply with a number of planning requirements, and it was just kind of odd, I guess. So this particular law, I'm sorry I don't have the number, but this particular law closed that loop. Now charter cities do have to comply with the planning requirements in the government code and planning and zoning law and so forth. I'm not sure if it actually is advancing when I press it. Yes, okay, good. CEQA guidelines. I wonder if, I wasn't here for Mary's presentation, but I wonder if this is the first time anyone has said the word CEQA today, which is, I find actually somewhat funny if that is the case, because it often comes up virtually at every environmental law conference that I go to. So I'm very impressed if this is the first time we're talking about it. I'm often talking about CEQA, so this is definitely a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. You may be aware that the Office of Planning and Research plays a very active role in updating the CEQA guidelines. Basically, our office begins the proposal. We begin we begin that phase of the rule. We do kind of like the pre-rulemaking, I would say. So you may have heard that last year in December 2018, OPR and the Resources Agency finalized the regulatory package for the CEQA guidelines update. And it was the largest package of, largest, most comprehensive package of guideline updates since 1998. So it had been a long time coming. There were definitely some things that needed to get cleaned up, and they did. The piece of the guidelines update that has gotten the most amount of attention has been this shift in how we measure transportation impact. So before, it was the metric to measure transportation impacts is something called level of service, and that's basically how you measure traffic flowing through a particular intersection or a roadway segment. And now, with this new guideline update, we have shifted to something called vehicle miles traveled. It's a very different approach. It is basically, at bottom, it's just a math calculation. It's just number of trips times the length of those trips. And so we're now shifting away from congestion, which is no longer an environmental impact, and we have now focused on how many trips does your project produce. So I just threw up here something from that piece of legislation that led to this particular update in the guidelines, and that's Senate Bill 743. I think this quote very well encapsulates the policy behind VMT, namely that this new transportation metric needs to focus on reducing greenhouse gases, focus on better connectivity, better access, complete streets, and also, I would say, being a better measurement of transportation impact. So I think it makes a lot of sense to focus, from a climate perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense for the CEQA guidelines to focus on the transportation impacts coming from the transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions, because as you can see from here, and this is from 2015, approximately, I think it's somewhere between 40 and 50% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from the transportation sector. Like I said, I think it makes a lot of sense to focus on the transportation sector as a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. So the key thing I would say that this new VMT policy does is that it essentially incentivizes infill development and location-efficient development. So before, when you were looking at congestion, you can imagine that a development in the suburbs and in greenfields would likely be able to show that there is not a transportation traffic impact because there may not be a lot of traffic already going to these greenfield areas. Under this new metric, VMT, it incentivizes, like I said, projects like this one, because a project like this one would normally have shown that there is a transportation impact, because a lot of times infill development, it's in these areas such as like downtown LA. If you were to put a new project there now, the transportation impact, because it is located near other because it is located by other services and transportation, there is presumed to be a less than significant transportation impact. And how this relates to housing is actually quite a lot, because it helps streamline. I'm glad Lewis is vigorously shaking his head. It helps streamline housing development. So I keep repeating that because it's very true. VMT helps streamline infill development. It incentivizes infill development. So what we're trying to do with that policy is not just incentivize housing in infill areas and location-efficient areas, but also looking towards the eye of reducing greenhouse gases. And also a very important piece to all of this is that we believe that VMT results in better public health outcomes. It is no secret that getting people walking to destinations is better for your health than sitting in a car for hours upon end. I think Jana talked very briefly about the California climate change investments. That's another initiative that began during the Brown administration, and it's basically a fund that comes from the cap and trade dollars and is used to fund greenhouse gas reducing projects, as well as projects that have a strong economic benefit. So to date, approximately $9.3 billion in cap and trade proceeds have been approved and given to 20 different state agencies. At least 35% of those investments have been made in disadvantaged communities. And I just want to point out an example of where some of this cap and trade money is going to. The Strategic Growth Council, I think somebody mentioned it before. So the director of OPR is the chair of the Strategic Growth Council. SGC has a number of different GGRF programs, but two of the biggest ones are called the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Project and the Transformative Climate Communities Project or Program. So both of these programs are focused on funding infill development and also infill development that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. There's been a lot of money that has been funded through these projects. For example, actually later this month, on June 22nd, I believe, or the 21st, SGC is going to be considering awards for projects throughout the state, and we're going to be awarding approximately $402 million. So that is not an insignificant amount of money. And then last year, the TCC program awarded about $50 million in funding for greenhouse gas reducing infill projects. Oh, sorry. Oh, no. Okay. All right, I was telling Julia earlier that I'm kind of a Luddite, so this was bound to happen. Well, anyway, so I'll pivot next to where are we headed. I don't have a crystal ball, but I can share perhaps some indicators of where we're headed in terms of housing and transportation policy. Is it up? Okay. So you may have heard there's an initiative at the state called the 50 million by 2050. So that's just a recognition that our state is going to be growing. It's projected to grow to 50 million people by the year 2050. That's only 31 years from now, so it's not right around the corner, but we do need to be thinking about it now. We need to be planning for it now. One of the broader questions that we've been asking ourselves at the state is, are we ready? Are we ready given the great challenges ahead of us? Are we ready given the ups and downs of the economy that may happen in the future, the change in demographics, the environment, a change in climate, the list goes on. And at OPR in particular, we're focused on, are we asking the question of, are we ready not only just to think about how much growth, but think about where is that growth going to go? Where can it go in an equitable and sustainable manner? So those are some of the conversations that's kind of like our water cooler talk at work. Where do we put people sustainably and equitably? It's actually kind of awesome. So like I said, I don't have all the answers for you today, but at OPR we are trying to seek a balance between all of these competing interests and competing concerns. So I'll just point out a few things on the horizon that you may want to keep an eye out that are coming. So I'll start with the governor's budget. So you may have seen that the May revise occurred. The budget has to be approved by the legislature very soon. I think it's sometime next week on the 15th, I believe. So in that budget, it hasn't passed yet, but I think we can expect that there's going to be more money for housing. The governor has proposed $1 billion to fight homelessness. There's going to be more money to remove barriers to building mixed income housing. The revised budget also includes spending from cap and trade for other things such as carbon sequestration and incentivizing farmers to capture carbon in their soils. There's going to be likely more money to replace old diesel trucks and farm equipment and school buses with cleaner technologies. So that is the revised budget, but there's also this thing, the trailer bill, which comes out after the revised budget. The trailer bill basically implements the governor's budget. So some things to also keep an eye out is that at least for now, in the draft language, there's language for more funding for housing, and as well as more money for planning grants, and also more money for infill infrastructure grants. So HCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, they already have a program that focuses on funding infrastructure for infill projects, and so there's the trailer bill proposes to include more money going to that effort. Two pieces that I think are really interesting to keep an eye out on is that first, the trailer bill language includes direction to housing and community development and OPR to basically work together and try to revamp this thing called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And so it's commonly known as RHNA. RHNA is basically how HCD assesses where the housing needs to go, and it divides it by income level. And then from that big number, it does it kind of at two levels. So it calculates the assessment at the state level, and then it works with the councils of governments to basically chop up that number and divide it throughout the state. And so that's the allocation portion. So there's been a lot of criticism about the RHNA process and the methodology. So the trailer bill directs HCD and OPR to try to revamp that process. So it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. Another thing to keep an eye out for is that the trailer bill directs HCD as well as OPR and the California State Transportation Agency to try to figure out what is the link between housing policy and transportation policy, and also linking transportation dollars to housing. So I know that's been kind of a hot topic as well, and definitely something else to keep an eye out. I do want to just quickly mention there is a CEQA trailer bill. I don't think it's gotten a lot of attention, but basically the bill would provide judicial streamlining for certain kinds of housing projects, namely emergency shelters, navigation centers, and supportive housing. And so it's kind of like AB 900 for any projects that get sued under CEQA. Those projects would have to make its way through the judicial process within 270 days. Another big thing is Senate Bill 50 by Scott Wiener. I'm not going to go into it that much because I'm going to leave that to Louis over here, and I'm sure it will come up, no doubt. One last thing.
What's Senate Bill 50? No, just
Maybe one of you could tell us. I do want to do a shout out really quickly for something that I think is going to be really cool that OPR is working on, the funding like I mentioned before, the funding comes from Senate Bill 2, which is that $75 real estate transaction fee. So in our office, we're going to be, at the end of later this year, we're expecting to unveil a CEQA mapping tool. We're very excited about this. So you will be able to basically go online. It's kind of going to be GIS-y. There will be different data layers that you can play with. You're going to be able to, we think, at this point, basically figure out, plug in an address or maybe a parcel number, and figure out, based on the location of that parcel or that address, what kind of CEQA exemptions could be applied in this situation. So we hope it'll be hopeful to a great number of public agencies and the public in general. And that's it.
Thank you for that background, Jeannie. And I think a lot of the changes that Jeannie talked about on the state level, particularly the CEQA guidelines, really highlight the role that land use planning can play in transportation sector emissions and the distribution of those emissions. So Louis, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about, yes, SB 50.
Sure.
But also our progress towards meeting our housing goals in the last few years of the Brown administration and now moving forward. And also, the impact that you see some of these changes that Jeannie's talked about having on meeting those goals.
Great. Yes, so thank you for having me. And it's very exciting for me personally that this panel is even a part of a major environmental discussion around the state, because for so long, housing as an issue has not been thought of as an environmental issue. Cap and trade, vehicle emissions, these things are the typical environmental topic, not necessarily housing. But we see housing, infill housing, especially as a very important strategy for meeting the state's climate targets. Dan Kamen at UC Berkeley has found that no intervention is as significant in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And ARB's research, coupled with a few other sources, has found that households that are living in downtown areas and urban areas will emit about 40 metric tons of carbon per year as compared to those living in suburbs, which will emit upwards of 60 metric tons per year. And controlling for all other things, that relationship exists only because of transportation and the emissions created by increased travel lengths. That's a significant part, I think, of getting towards our 2045 goals, and so does ARB. They're recently released a report pursuant to SB 150 from Senator Allen a few years ago. That report found that the state of California is not on track to meet our climate emissions, that VMT, vehicle miles traveled per person, is actually increasing, and that increase is, well, not even just the increase, but the fact that it's not going down by what it needs to go down for us to meet our goals per the scoping plan, is going to be singularly responsible for us not meeting our targets, which I argue adds a very compelling case towards the case for housing on just an affordability front, which is already compelling enough in California. So I guess I'd start off by talking a little bit more about the context for state housing legislation. There mostly isn't much. Part of the challenge that we've run into on Senate Bill 50, which is Senator Wiener's bill to allow, broadly speaking, allow more housing around transit, the highest frequency transit in the state and in high opportunity areas. Part of the challenge that we've run into there is it's very much a first in what it tries to do, and there's really no context for it in state law. So in the 70s and the 80s, the state passed the Housing Accountability Act and the Density Bonus Program, which both sort of try to get towards densifying a little bit and holding local governments accountable to their own rules. But it wasn't until last year or 2017, that there was a penalty for violating the HAA. So many cities, especially progressive cities on the coast, were openly flouting the HAA and would say, well, just take us to court. Then you go through 4 rounds of appeals, and by the time that the developers won the appeal, he's also bankrupt, and it's sort of moot at that point that the local government's lost. So SB 167 from Senator Skinner was the first to add real penalties, $10,000 per unit into a local affordable housing fund for the first time. The state also has legislation that you heard a little bit about SB 743, which aims to streamline CEQA a little bit more around transit, and that's definitely been helpful. The more important bill, I think, though, for combating the state's environmental challenges and our housing challenges could have been SB 375 from then Pro Tem Steinberg. That requires local governments to go through sustainable community strategies planning that is supposed to shift planning and development and housing generally towards areas around transit. But the state, at the last minute, did not give itself the authority to actually influence local zoning codes, which was essential for the success of SB 375 if it were going to be successful, which the report from SB 150 has shown that it's not been. Zoning, folks here are familiar with zoning, I hope, in some way, but I have to go into it just for my own liability's sake. Zoning is what a local government says you can do on a specific piece of land. It says whether you can build an apartment or a single-family home, a store or a factory, and it's critical. It's a critical part of land use in California, and there is almost no law at the state level that influences land use in a significant way, as it influences zoning specifically. So there's a lot of planning that's supposed to be related to what zoning is, but in the end, there is no actual requirement for it to be related, and in many cases, it's not, which has been, I think, a big failure of allowing our state to move towards more transit-oriented development in general and infill housing in general. So SB 50 was a proposal to kind of short circuit, well, I should say, is a proposal to short circuit that challenge by saying that land use patterns have to be directly related to the conditions on the ground, be them transit or the level of opportunity that a person has growing up there. Opportunity is usually measured by fair housing scholars to be things like lifetime income or access to quality schools, access to quality air quality, quality environment, that type of thing. And the reason, or part of the reason that it's elicited so much of a reaction from around the state is that it addressed zoning for the first time at the state level in a very meaningful way, changing what local governments essentially were allowed to do and set for the first time, or propose to set for the first time, real standards on what local governments can do. Now, a lot of folks have sort of pushed back on this, looking more for an incentives-based approach. My perspective is that an incentives-based approach, which is largely the one the state of California has had for a long time, since the 50s or the 60s, has mostly failed us. The Regional Housing Needs Assessment, which is the major tool for compelling local governments towards action on housing, is usually not met by any jurisdiction. Well, it's met by a handful of jurisdictions around the state. There are about 550 jurisdictions that are subject to the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, which is that process through HCD. And last year, about 17 actually met their needs, meaning that they provided housing for people who can afford market rate and for below market rate housing needs. One of the cities that did meet its need was the city of Beverly Hills, a city of 35,000 people, quite expensive. I certainly can't afford to move there. And the regional housing need for Beverly Hills was 3 units of housing. It blew that out of the water by building 9. And, you know, in a state where Beverly Hills is quite a great spot to grow up, it's right along some of the highest quality transit on the West Coast. It has access to downtown Los Angeles pretty quickly, where there are hundreds of thousands of jobs for which there are no people living in Los Angeles, and people who commute from outside of Los Angeles, you know, driving those commutes up, driving that VMT up, driving those emissions up, and leading to the spot where California is seriously looking at not meeting its climate responsibilities from SB 32, and almost entirely so because of our transportation and land use sector, which you saw earlier is the single largest contributor to emissions in California. So SB 50 proposed essentially to change local government rules where those rules were a barrier to high density housing. It said that around rail stations and around the highest quality bus lines and in high opportunity areas, you can build up to 50 feet. You can't build in high fire areas. You can decontrol the density. So in most places of the state, 75% of the state of California, it's illegal to build something that has more than 2 families living in it. And so our proposal was to decontrol that and say, well, as long as it meets health and safety codes, you can put more families in it than what local zoning would allow. And the approach there was very much towards solving the state's historic housing shortage. Just this week, we got the results of the Point-in-Time Count, which is the federal government's largest tool for figuring out what homelessness is in California. Homelessness in Los Angeles went up 12% over last year. Homelessness in Alameda County went up 43%. Homelessness in Santa Clara County went up by 42%. Just like historic double-digit increases in homelessness around the state of California, which really, really should compel lawmakers towards action on housing, and this year has not. The state has no meaningful tenant protections, like rent control or anything like that, and very significant just cause bills, which would establish that landlords can't evict somebody but for a just cause, failed passage in their respective houses. Another one, SB 529, which would have allowed tenants to unionize, also failed. And so we're looking at this, sort of scratching our heads, trying to figure out what's going on, because the polling for tenant protections and for building more housing generally is actually quite good. Just yesterday, PPIC released a poll showing that SB 50 or the provisions thereof were supported by broadly 65% of people in California. That confirmed polling that California YIMBY did and a few other organizations did earlier in the year. The polls similarly show support for tenant protections, traditional tenant protections. So it's somewhat of a political challenge, I think, now for making sure that lawmakers understand that their constituents are broadly behind aggressive action on housing and housing as it relates to climate. You know, that infill housing is often the one that local government officials will get phone calls about, you know, folks in the neighborhood complaining, but those folks are the only ones who are motivated to call in, because it's them who experience a sense of personal affliction by that proposed two-story building. And so what the YIMBY movement has tried to offer is the counter narrative, that there are people in those neighborhoods who are fine, who even support housing more of their neighbors in a more equitable way than those people who are calling in, but just sort of don't do so because they haven't been organized before. And so we're really trying to approach this from an organizing and a political standpoint, which has yielded some success. Folks in the business community and in the labor community are broadly supporting SB 50. Folks in the environmental world and the anti-environmental world are also supporting SB 50. It's really just a concern of folks who really just are deeply concerned with apartments in their neighborhoods and from local governments. So we've been pretty thoughtful about trying to apply what you heard from Ken Alex earlier, this ideology from the governor of not trying to pick too many enemies at once. There are many barriers that we could knock down to housing or propose to knock down to housing, and we're trying to focus just on that land use barrier, which has been a major one for state law, and it's still caused quite a ruckus. Even within the environmental community, it's been a challenge. The Sierra Club last year was a notable opponent of Senate Bill 827, which was a predecessor to SB 50. They were very concerned about it from a race equity lens, which is a very important and I think a significant part, has been a significant part of trying to improve SB 50, increasing tenant protections, requiring more below market rate housing, although, you know, we are still sort of in conversations about trying to get more support from equity community groups. That's an ongoing conversation, even though the bill is now stalled in Senate Appropriations because it'll come back next year as a 2-year bill. And so just thinking through some of these challenges, trying to show this coalition essentially who supports real action on housing has been a primary goal for California YIMBY for sure, but also trying to change the narrative on housing as an environmental issue. So, you know, just back to my original point, I'm very glad to see so many important people here gathered today to think about housing as an environmental issue.
Thanks, Louis. Jennifer, Louis talked about the lack of tenant protections and our historic homelessness increase this year. And I'm wondering if you can offer us a perspective on displacement and equity issues that are implicated by efforts to build more housing and transit.
Sure. So I have a PowerPoint,
And I just want to give a shout out to my intern, Ross, who put it together and helped me. And on my other intern, Edelmise, who's here. So we're all here. CBE is in full force. So CBE, I just want to introduce, prior to it's doing housing, obviously has always been something that CBE does, but more so living on a frontline community, living against an oil refinery, living against the freeway, et cetera. And we do a great job about, fighting a lot of environmental injustice. So I wanted to couch that in this is where CBE is coming from. I'm going to be referencing, I have a fact sheet, I left a couple of them outside, but CBE is also a member of the California Environmental Justice Alliance, and we have a great fact sheet about CEQA and housing. I'm not going to speak specifically about bills, but I did want to give a snapshot of the things that I've seen and the things that I know that's happening. So Communities for a Better Environment represents folks in South LA or Southeast LA and the South Bay, as well as up in the Bay Area, East Oakland and Richmond. I want to talk about particularly Huntington Park. So I think you, Louis, you were talking about Rena. I think both of you were talking about Rena. So Huntington Park actually is not in compliance with their housing element. Hasn't been in compliance for a while, and actually hasn't even built a single unit since 2008. And I can give you a snapshot of what Huntington Park looks like. So in Huntington Park, this is the spot where we ran a lot of our campaigns. We mobilized the folks in Huntington Park against the Exide battery plant that's in Vernon. We also have been working since 2002, fighting with Metro and Caltrans because they want to expand the 710 freeway and not taking into consideration how that would impact the Southeast cities. And now we have this housing issue. We don't have enough housing. So in Huntington Park, there are nearly 58,000 people. Most of the Southeast cities are actually very dense. Huntington Park's one, Maywood is one, Southgate is one. But in the city of Huntington Park, in addition to that, most people are only paying, the median gross rent is about $985. That's really low in LA County because if you look at LA City, a 2-bedroom is typically closer to $1,800. Also in Huntington Park, 73% of those folks are tenants, and 28% of those people are living in poverty. And the average gross income is it's below $35,000. So that's Huntington Park, and Huntington Park is pretty, indicative of what's happening in the Southeast cities. In my practice as being an eviction defense attorney, the stats that we used to give were about 55,000 evictions were filed in the county each year. Of that 55,000, only less than 2% of those people will get legal representation, right? So what does housing have to do with any of that? A lot of people end up leaving LA County because they get into an eviction. So this is kind of now my jam, right? Like I'm like, oh, right, environmental justice. I did that as a housing, as doing youth organizing through CBE, and now I've done housing for the last several years. Before I go on to the slides, I just wanted to give how housing and environmental justice go together. Environmental justice means creating healthy and affordable housing for everyone, especially for communities with fewer resources and more barriers. To do this, we must acknowledge the role that planning decisions play in the housing crisis, which disproportionately concentrate toxic and polluting land uses in disadvantaged or EJ communities, leading to worsening housing quality, stability, and choice in these neighborhoods. So when we're talking about environmental justice in housing, we're talking about when we reduce greenhouse gases in our communities, when we actually work in our communities and organize in these low-income communities of color, we're actually going to start solving the problem. So if I guess the next slide. So some of the, it's okay. So the CB has been working to sort of figure out how do we wed these things together. We're talking about, we've been fighting for so many years. CB's been around for about 40 years. In some of our communities, we've been making such great gains. But now what do we do as we've actually won? We've fought a lot of the, we've closed power plants. We've filed lawsuits against oil refineries that are expanding. But how do we make sure that we don't displace the people we've been fighting for? And I think that's kind of where we're at, right? So Metro is building the West Santa Ana branch that's going to be running through the Southeast cities. There will be 2 stops in Huntington Park. I think like the stats I'm going back to about what Huntington Park looks like, there is a great transit ridership in Huntington Park. But the thing is, if we continue to build without actually figuring out what the community wants, there's a great chance that we're going to displace them. And this is where we have to start talking about, yes, we need housing, but what kind of housing? When I've already told you that 28% of Huntington Park lives in poverty. So would a lot of those people be able, who are renters, would they be able to pay market rate in downtown LA, where you see rents for $3,000? Just in the city of Los Angeles itself, you know, Social Security and general relief haven't been risen like since the 90s. So Social Security right now, the payments are about $931.72. That's if you are getting Social Security or SSI. If you're on general relief, you're only getting $221. So when we're talking about homelessness on the rise, this has been something that's been happening. Like we are building housing, but we're not building the housing that a lot of the folks that we talk about and we represent can actually get into. Even if you got a Section 8 voucher, chances are that a landlord isn't going to take that Section 8 voucher because the subsidy for it isn't going to make up for it. So we need to figure out this equity piece. That's the piece where how do we make sure that when we're talking about housing, it's not going to displace people. So I think that Metro had stated that there was ridership had decreased. And a lot of it has to do because people are being displaced. People who live along bus routes, who would normally take, you know, for instance, Echo Park. Echo Park used to be a place where lots of people would take the bus and they take the 2 up and down. I think that, you know, the LA Times covers this often. But those people have been displaced in the last decade. There are people who used to pay, I mean, I've represented some of these folks where they pay $725 for a 2-bedroom and they get evicted for different things. Like if they don't have an advocate there, then a lot of those people will leave because they don't know what to do. There's no right to counsel. There's no one there to explain to you about housing situations. So this is kind of where all of this comes together. If we keep pushing out the poorest folks in our communities, the people who don't have advocates, where are they going to end up going? They still have to work in LA, so they're going to obviously be traveling. So if you, I'm so sorry, Ross, that I didn't use your slides. But because I think that there's a lot here, because this is a conversation that folks in the environmental community as well as the housing community, we need to talk about this. We need to talk about this as access to housing as well as access to clean air, right? Like you're seeing this in South LA, you're seeing this in the South Bay, you're seeing this, like Los Angeles is not the only city that is experiencing homelessness as an issue. Homelessness is an issue throughout the nation. People are not being able to afford these things. And it's also because there's an issue about land speculation. There were more slides that had information about this, I know. But I just wanted to kind of paint this picture. Like we're sitting in a time where we're talking about housing and environmentalism. We're talking about how do we wed these things together. But when we start to build, I think you can just go to the last slide because there's a great equity slide that Ross put in there. So this is what we need to be working towards. You know, I think that I'm glad to be here to talk about this because I know that it's difficult to talk about like how do we help house everybody that's here. We can't just get rid of people who aren't able to pay for different things, because when you start looking at how much does it cost for a voucher to put someone somewhere else, you're actually ending up spending more money instead of creating actual housing that people can afford. And I think that's this whole thing, like this community has a bunch of different people in it. In our community, it shouldn't just be about the people who can pay for things. We should all make sure that other people get to live in this community, because there's a wide range of folks in the county, in the state. And I think that's where we are right now.
Thanks, Jennifer. Divya, I'm wondering if you can go back a couple of slides to, Jen had a great graph in there. Yeah, there we go. Because I want to ask you all about, this is a theme that's kind of run through the presentations today, but the tensions that exist between these goals. So, I think when Jeannie was talking a little bit about our changes in land use and climate policy, and from an outsider's perspective, it might look like these things kind of go hand in glove. We want to build infill development, and that puts development closer to transit, and that means reduced VMT, and that's good for everybody. But I think Jen just highlighted some of the nuances in that relationship, and so I'm wondering if each of you can kind of speak to tensions and conflicts that you see running through these dual policy goals of the state.
Sure, I'll kick it off. So tensions within the state policy generally, is the question? There are many. One of the biggest tensions is on how we spend transportation dollars. The state of California spends about $30 billion a year of money it controls to differing degrees on transportation. The vast majority of that money goes to improving and expanding roads that people drive on. Now, if I say the phrase induced demand, are people broadly familiar with induced demand? I see some nods, but not enough. So induced demand is an engineering principle that says if you expand the supply of something, the supply of roadway, the number of people who demand it, or the demand for it rather, goes up. So induced demand basically says you can't solve a congestion problem by widening your highways in the same way that you can't solve a weight problem by buying a bigger belt. It says you sort of need a new strategy for approaching transportation itself. The state of California spent about $2.5 billion widening the highway that goes over the Sepulveda Pass. And that highway met its 10-year induced demand model within 8 days of opening, meaning that the effect on congestion from a $2.5 billion investment, the effect on congestion only existed for 8 days, meaning that more road users now use that road as a result of widening it, and so congestion is at about the same level. There are just more people in that congestion. That's broadly speaking incompatible with what the state's trying to do to meet our AB 32 and SB 32 legal responsibilities, and is probably the largest. It's probably the largest. I mean, aside from the just like the environmental justice aspects of why we shouldn't be doing this, it's probably on its face the biggest tension within state law right now. On the one hand, you're trying to do one thing that's explicitly antagonistic to the thing you're trying to do at the other hand. I think there are a lot of other elements too, especially on the more housing related on the more housing related side that I don't know if they're in tension necessarily, but definitely deserve to be improved. I think the regional housing needs allocation process is probably the best example of that. The way that it understands housing markets is not broadly accepted by academics who study housing or economists. One of its biggest shortcomings, for example, is that there's no carryover, and this again is because of regulatory capture from the people that RHNA is supposed to regulate, specifically local governments. But the State Housing and Community Development Department is explicitly forbidden from carrying over shortfall from one cycle to the next cycle. So the shortfall just disappears mathematically, which again is not how price works. It's definitely not how housing markets work. And I think I think if the state's going to get serious about solving the housing crisis, it's going to need to come from our environmental leaders around the state. Not only recognizing which they do, but continuing to lead this charge on infill housing in a way that aligns the costs of doing something, namely building infill housing, with the externalities it creates. Because if you talk to most developers right now, the vast majority of them will tell you it's extremely cheap relatively in California to build, like the Tejon Ranch, which is going to add 10,000 units to LA's housing market out in the desert. It's extremely cheap per unit to build those, and the most expensive place to build is in downtown LA, or where it's legal to build, and it's not even legal in places like Beverly Hills or on the west side of LA, which are arguably the best places to put market rate housing. So aligning those incentives with the externalities they create is going to be extremely important. And the argument that local governments should be chiefly or solely in charge of regulating their land use is very similar to the argument that essentially environmental polluters should not be required to internalize the costs that they create. That, a place like Beverly Hills, which adds a laughable 9 units of housing that's over an 8-year cycle, if I wasn't clear about that earlier. That's an 8-year cycle. A place like Beverly Hills, which graduates thousands of high school graduates over that timeline, should be required to provide much more housing than it currently is, because the recipe for disaster is one where you sort of say that the population of Beverly Hills, the population of places like San Francisco or Marin, there are so many cities in the county of Marin that have a lower population than they did in the late 1980s that I can't even recount all of them, but my favorite is Tiburon, because it's served by extremely high access bus service, a ferry that's 20 minutes from downtown San Francisco, and is slated for rail investment at some point in the future. So these places are places that we're pouring massive amounts of public money in many places, like especially highway widenings. We're doing it's in a way that's antagonistic to meeting our climate goals, that's causing more driving, and
Workers can get there,
sorry.
so that workers could get there, right, like to service these homes, the people in the homes?
Yes, essentially, and it is generally something that's very ripe for reform.
I agree with Louis. There are many tensions that we could literally spend all day talking about. I do want to highlight Louis's comment about RENA, and I agree that it is very odd that Beverly Hills only had to reduce 3 and went the distance and did 9. But I'm really hopeful that with the trailer bill language, at least in draft form, I'm hopeful that there will be a better process and better methodology for the RENA process that OPR will have a hand in, as well as HCD. So we have yet to see what is to come out of that process, but like I said, I'm very hopeful about it. I think that something that we're all kind of seeing is that the tensions between housing and transportation policy are because that we have such a varied state. It's very trite to say that there's no one size fits all, but it's actually really, really true. So if you talk to planners in Butte County versus San Francisco, you're going to get very different reactions. If you're going to, the concern up in Butte County is not that they don't have the land, but it's because they cannot find qualified developers to actually build the homes. They do have parcels of land and plots that have already been entitled, but they cannot find a qualified developer to build them. And it also relates to economic development because there aren't enough jobs up there to bring people to these homes. And the homes that the developers want to sell them for, the prices cannot be borne by the market as they currently are. So, and that's a very different story from San Francisco and LA and more urban areas. So I think one tension that we see at a broader level is just the differences in this state. It's clear that a lot of the inequality, or there's a lot of wealth and growth that has been targeted and seen on the coastal areas, but not so much on the inland areas. You may have heard that just a few weeks ago that the governor's office did unveil a new initiative called Regions Rise Together, with the goal of just going throughout the state, identifying what are the issues in this varied state, and trying to figure out a comprehensive approach so that all the boats rise together. So please keep an eye out for that. That's also another initiative that OPR, in conjunction with the Governor's Office of Business Development, are going to be spearheading.
Something that when we were putting this together and I was thinking about going back to this issue of gentrification, this issue of having transit-oriented development in spots that might necessarily not have inclusionary zoning, not having, when you're developing on those sites, and not requiring those developers to create something that would provide deeply affordable housing. I think that's something to look at, right? Like, I think that I had mentioned before, you see transit ridership drop in LA, and a lot of that has to do with the displacement of people who used to live in the city center who would be using public transit. I think that there are just a lot of stats that 88% of Metro bus riders are people of color. And more than 50% of those folks who are Metro riders have something or have a family income of below $15,000. And if you're building transit-oriented development that isn't thinking about the equity piece, that isn't thinking about how do we make sure that when we come into a community that might have been displaced, like what is the value capture of that neighborhood, right? So because you're in a neighborhood and you're building next to transit, what is the benefit as a developer or as a building that you're now gonna have tenants and you have this? Like, how do you give back to that community? And I think, I don't know how to make that a thing when we're thinking about developments, but I think it is about a planning issue and how, in environmental justice, we always talk about like people over profits. This is exactly the same thing, except this is about housing and thinking about housing, what types of housing is being built. So I think there's a little bit of that tension there.
I want to be cognizant of leaving time for the audience to ask a few questions, so I'm just going to ask one more. And it's this. We heard from Yana this morning that one of her least favorite lines is, "That's a local land use decision. We don't have anything to do with that." Local control is something that comes up a lot, and we saw it come up again with SB 50 this year. What do you feel is the role that state can play in building more infill and affordable housing?
Sure. I'll jump at that. So this morning, the Southern California Association of Governments, SCAG, considered an item to update its regional housing needs allocation for the next cycle, consistent with legislation that was passed in 2017 and 2018, most notably SB 828 from Senator Wiener, which requires additional considerations of housing need in especially as they relate to cost and a person's ability to pay that cost. And SCAG just decided to not do it. They said that they're not going to comply with SB 828. And so a lot of advocates today are scratching their heads about what that means for 828 and the need for future RHNA legislation. And I think highlights the importance of the government, especially at the state level, getting directly involved with the construction of housing. The federal government used to play a massive role in the production of public and affordable housing. It no longer plays that role. The state of California has increasingly tried to step up to that challenge, but the challenge is huge. In California, the current need for affordable housing is about $500 billion. We spend about $5 billion on affordable housing per year. And in many jurisdictions, models would suggest that we're not going to meet our existing needs for affordable housing for literally hundreds of years. And those are just our existing needs, not future needs. So the state, in my opinion, should get much more involved in both land use decisions and in the production of housing, because the federal government has largely abdicated that role, and local governments and the representatives, like SCAG, have largely shown an interest in not doing very much on housing, especially outside of San Diego. Regional association boards are largely controlled by small, usually more wealthy suburbs within the jurisdiction who prefer things like highway widening and who prefer things like single-family homes and rapidly appreciating home values to the opposite of those. And if the state wants to overcome that incentive at the local government to reward those preferences, it needs to recognize that the externalities those preferences create give the state a reasonable state interest, compelling state interest in solving them, in forcing either those externalities to be internalized by the actors who are making those decisions, or to make those decisions for them in a way that does not produce the externalities. So largely speaking, the state should get much more involved in the production of housing, especially of affordable housing, than it has in the past, and largely sort of do away with the era of pure local control that has maintained in California for the last about 100 years.
I'm going to go back to my SEHA fact sheet that I've not passed out, but exists somewhere. There are some copies in the front. I think a really big part that that folks in SEHA have been working on is we're talking about we need CEQA, and CEQA is important, and I think that it is important for the state to not get rid of it. I think it is one of the only ways for our communities to actually have a voice and talk about things. But with that said, I mean, there is room for improvement, and I think things that should be included into CEQA should include displacement and greenhouse gas reductions. And I think, though, that I know that sounds really annoying to a lot of developers, but those are the things that we need to think about if we are going to build a more equitable state.
And I'll just, I guess I'll just close by saying that I think the two interesting pieces to me that have yet to come, and those are in the trailer bill, and I mentioned them before. It's OPR and HCD's role in revamping RENA, which I know we've talked a lot about before, and it's clear that there are a lot of opinions about it. And also just how I'm curious to see how the state moves forward with connecting transportation dollars to housing production. I think that'll be a very interesting conversation. So we'll see. Stay tuned.
Okay, we have a couple of minutes for audience questions. I see a lot of hands. Go over here first.
Yes, it's for Louis. So you said earlier that you didn't really think it was a good idea to make too many entities at one time. And I would just say that you've made one gigantic entity. I think that the issue is a constitutional issue in California. California has home rule in its constitution. The entire relationship between the state is delegated its police powers to local governments. So this is a big change that you're making, and it's an important change, but it's also a very big generational change. For people that were born and raised in the 20th century, the single-family home was the most important thing. For cities that incorporated in the 20th century, they did it for local land use control and controlling density. Separation of different densities of households were really, really important. Now all of that needs to be upended. So the fight you have is a really serious fight, but ultimately requires some kind of change in the state constitution, because that's, when you get reactions like we did from SCAG, you can see how serious the fight is. So good luck.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask that future questions be questions and not, no worries. Yeah, in the back.
So to follow up on that, the state constitution says that charter cities, or the charters, may make and enforce all ordinances and regulations in respect to municipal affairs. So, and we heard today from the panel that zoning is something that municipal officials do. My question is, what is the constitutional status in terms of court rulings of provisions like those in SB 50 that purportedly would have overruled single household zoning in much of the state? What's the constitutional status of the things that you want the state to step in and do?
So just to paraphrase the question, it's about the constitutionality of legislative efforts like SB 50, which would take away some modicum of local control and impose kind of statewide zoning mandates.
Yeah, very briefly, I just want to say I'm not a lawyer, so there are other people who can answer this question a little bit more accurately probably than I can. but the states consider that specific question in at least two instances. One on accessory dwelling units, which are essentially like backyard cottages or conversions of existing buildings. Whether or not ADU law applies to charter cities because it's a charter city or not, that question has been answered that no, indeed those laws do apply. So the state is legally able in those instances to compel essentially greater density in those areas.
At what court level?
I'm not sure. I couldn't answer that question. But it's also held up under the state's density bonus law, which has been around since the late 80s.
Yeah, in the back.
Great. Two questions. First one is for Louis. Given the displacement of existing low-income transit riders by market rate development around transit, would you support a more narrowly focused version of SB 50 that only supersedes local zoning around job-rich areas like Santa Monica and Beverly Hills, instead of including transit as well? That's the first question. Second question, I think you brought up a really good point about the MPOs being often beholden to the more affluent, smaller communities. And this question is for the whole panel. What types of changes do you think would help transform local governance so that whether it's making one person, one vote for MPOs and air quality districts, or whether it is restructuring local cities so that we don't have one city that's 40% of LA County and then 87 other cities that are much, much smaller? I'd like to hear any thoughts on that.
Okay, so there were a couple of questions, and I'm going to paraphrase both of them. The first was how, and specifically for Louis, how would you feel about a version of SB 50 that's limited to kind of, I'll call them high-income neighborhoods, as opposed to expanding those upzoning requirements to transit-oriented areas? And the second is about how can we restructure MPOs and local associations, regional associations of governments, to make sure that there is equal say and equity in those relationships.
And also whether to consolidate or reorganize municipal government.
Sure, I'll take that quickly because I'm getting grilled up here and I want to leave my panelists an opportunity to get grilled. But so I think quickly on the first question, broadly speaking, there's abundance of research that more housing generally at a regional level does decrease price and does allow for or does encourage less displacement. But at the very neighborhood level of whether or not pure market rate building is going to do that at the very small neighborhood level in a low income community, that evidence is a lot less clear. And there's more evidence, in fact, that market rate housing in that neighborhood actually has an increased displacement effect and an increase in price effect. So my preference is for what SB 50 proposes, which is essentially to filter those communities out or allow them to self-determine that they want to be in. This sensitive communities provision is one that we've been working on quite diligently with race equity advocates at the state level, and I think we're very close to getting it right. I think that's acknowledged around all sides of the table, and it's very important, I think, to everyone, including California YIMBY, that is a part of what's right, because the worst thing that could happen from something like SB 50 is that it actually does harm in trying to solve California's, or to be a part of California's solution to the housing crisis. The second question I can answer quickly. The model is AB 805, which the previous governor signed and Assembly Member Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher got through the legislature. It is a wonderful bill that reorients, does many things to the San Diego, this is why I say except for San Diego, does many things to the San Diego Council of Governments. They're called SANDAG. Chief among them is it reorients the internal voting structure. This is unbelievably complicated and insane that there are so many variations on this at the state, but every MPO has its own voting structure internal to the MPO. This one changed SANDAG's voting structure. Short of it is, basically 2 large cities can appeal a decision of SANDAG and request a populationally adjusted vote. So instead of voting like the United States Senate, where every city gets the same number of votes, votes are weighted like they are in the House of Representatives and then cast. And so Sandag has exercised its authority to do this on numerous occasions, most notably with their RENA figures. This is, I think, actually a great example of a place where RENA has actually succeeded, because HCD came to Sandag to get them to start the process of updating for the next cycle. Sandag rejected HCD's numbers categorically and threatened a lawsuit. The two largest cities in San Diego then petitioned for an appeal of that decision. Sandag reversed itself and accepted those numbers, which is now the law of the land, and it's in the process of now allocating for the next cycle. So it was this big about face internally to Sandag, which was empowered by shifting the voting structure within Sandag, and I think that should serve as a model for the rest of the MPOs in the state.
Jeannie, Jen, other thoughts on MPOs? Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I'm gonna go.
Okay, so a question about the density bonus law. Personally, I live in more of a suburb area. I live near Calabasas, so it's very much a privileged white area, to say the least. And there are developments that have come forward when they get approved for density bonuses, and then there's no affordable or under market rate units. So where's the enforcement of saying you got this density bonus because you said you're going to have units that were lower than market rate, and then all of a sudden there are no units that are affordable. So where is there an enforcement aspect? Where does that come into play, or am I just missing that?
So the question is about density bonus incentives and enforcement mechanisms to make sure that developers actually include affordable housing in projects when they receive density bonuses.
We've decided that Lewis is our spokesperson.
So my other panelists here are very interesting, and you should ask them questions because they've had a lot of very interesting stuff to say. But what I can say is that the state's existing density bonus law, which I'm going to shorthand to DBL, establishes that a developer can seek from a local government an increase in the maximum allowable density if certain conditions are met. And those certain conditions must be met, or the local government will have every right to refuse that project, and the state has no authority to compel that project. One of those responsibilities on every project that receives DBL is to provide some level of affordability. So I can't speak to the specific project that you're thinking of, but there isn't a DBL project that I'm familiar with that has successfully evaded that requirement in state law. It would be very uncommon. You can seek what's called a zoning change from a local government. So you can go to a local government and say, will you willfully, like of your own accord, allow me to build a 4-story building here where you originally said I can only build a 1-story building? And some cities do say yes to that because they want that development. Other cities like Los Angeles say, yes, but as a condition of getting that upzone, you're also going to have to provide more affordability. So the city of Los Angeles has a very successful program that's actually built thousands of extremely low-income housing units, affordable to people making 30% of area median income or less, that essentially utilizes this value capture method of saying, we're conferring some value on your development by allowing you to do more with it, and we're going to expect you to provide some below market rate housing as a condition to that. Those programs are pretty successful. That's actually the model that SB 50 uses in how it approaches land use.
I was also going to say it kind of depends on the level of affordability, because I've also seen projects that are built pretty much close to Skid Row, and the affordability level is 80% AMI, which is pretty high, which is not somebody in Skid Row would be able to live in that unit.
Yeah, so AMI, for those who don't know, is area median income. And so what Jen's pointing out is that sometimes area median income, which is determined on a county-wide level, is not necessarily the right metric in individual neighborhoods where people may make way less than what the county median income is. I think we're going to leave it there. Before I close out the panel, I just want to remind those of you who are attorneys, we have evaluation forms. Please fill them out and leave them for us at the table in the front. And please join me in thanking our fabulous panelists.